Welcome to the State of the Clean Economy After the Vote, produced by the Globe Series and Corporate Knights. I'm Chris Henderson. I'm chair of the Globe Series and president of Lumos Energy, and we're here at the beautiful Museum of Nature, a place that the Parliament of Canada once met. Joining me for this dialogue are Jessica Butt, Senior Director of the Delphi Group, Toby Heaps, co-founder and president of Corporate Knights, and Grace Hamilton-Burge, who is a Masters of Engineering candidate in Sustainable Energy and Policy at Carleton University. Thank you for joining us. Over the next half hour, we're going to unpack this election. Does a liberal minority mean different things for economy and environment? For those of us working for a low carbon or even a zero carbon economy, what does the future hold? What does the path forward mean for us, and what challenges can we expect, and what opportunities are before us? We'll be answering these questions and more today. But this is part of a dialogue that involves you, watching online. Thank you for tuning in. There are many people in the Globe and the Corporate Knights community that are part of this dialogue. In fact, we are all panelists. Please keep the conversation going on Facebook or on Twitter using the hashtag #GlobeAfterTheVote. Let's begin. Canadians have voted. Canadians have had their say. I'd like to go with a high-level question, if I might, to you, Toby. Politics aside, what's the one thing business can take to show their leadership to accelerate a clean transition?
Well, the solutions are on the shelf. We have zero emissions vehicles, we have zero carbon ready buildings, we have clean techniques to get oil and gas out of the ground. They're affordable, they save a lot of money, but they're not flying off the shelf. If we want them to fly off the shelf, the best thing we can do is put down a big pot of money, about $300 billion, and say anybody who wants to deploy carbon solutions, climate solutions, come at it.
And I think, from my opinion, one of the really interesting things that we see with this election is that for the first time, I think really in Canadian history, climate change and sustainability has been a defining issue for many, if not the majority of voters. And though regardless, we know that there are ebbs and flows in policy over the years, and that really the scientific imperative of action, we can't afford those ebbs and flows. And so from my perspective, one of the most important actions that corporates can take in the near term, sort of regardless of the policy drivers, is to quantify the climate risk to their business. We are seeing that the physical impacts, the investor expectations, the consumer expectations in this respect are driving business as much as or more than policy at this point.
Absolutely, and I think that when we talk about quantifying those risks and we talk about corporate leadership and sustainability, making sure that those the sustainable commitments are science-based targets, so that when the organization is moving forward and really trying to reduce their emissions, they've created science-based targets and they're having a transparent process so people can hold them accountable, and so that the public can see how businesses are moving forward in the sustainability front.
Thanks, guys. What I heard, Toby, follow the money. Jessica, you're saying quantify the climate risk. And what you're saying, Grace, is make sure you get the science out there. Follow the science and the facts. Thanks. One of the things that I find disconnected for me, though, is when I look at energy, one of the best things you can do in terms of how it impacts climate and the economy is don't use it. It's wasting it. We're among the worst, if not the worst, energy wasters in the world. Jessica, how do we deal with that?
Yeah, the trillion-dollar question, right? Yeah. I think, at the individual level, we all know that there's a personal accountability, and again, to this idea that climate was obviously a deciding issue for a lot of voters this year, and yet I think we all, as individuals, as consumers, struggle with that accountability and how we take what we see as sort of either small or meaningless actions that, taken together, can make a big change. I think we all know that those are things that need to happen at the household level, and that there are a number of government incentives and policy drivers that can be put in place, everything from carbon pricing, which we now have and will continue to see under a Liberal minority with support from the NDP and Greens. But really to reach the scale that is necessary, there needs to be things like these large-scale transformational investments that Toby was speaking of that get us to the industrial efficiencies and really look at that transition of our overall energy system, which is, of course, much more difficult than just turning off the lights or using less single-use plastics in our homes.
I think that when you look at this, we have buildings and we have industry. Both of them are energy inefficient, and we have the solutions on the shelf that are affordable to decarbonize them or relatively decarbonize them. But it's a survival issue when we're talking about our oil and gas industry. We're seeing a dramatic decline in the cost of extraction of oil, a barrel of oil. We're seeing demand get eaten up by electrification of transport. And if our oil sector is going to have a chance to compete in the 21st century, it's critical that they reduce their costs. And they know that down there in Calgary, where I'm from. But there's a lot of these shelves that are on the shelf, and a lot of these solutions are on the shelf. If we want them to fly off, we have to show some money, and then they'll fly off the shelf.
So that's even in the oil and gas industry in terms of reducing its energy footprint.
Yeah, there are all sorts of solutions that can reduce the cost of extraction by $5 per barrel, which can be the difference between having a business or not having a business over the next couple of decades. And the payback on a lot of these solutions is 2, 3, 4 years. Suncor's just deployed $1.4 billion, so going to have a payback inside of 3 years. And huge greenhouse gas reductions, huge cost savings, and we need business to really step up to the plate and do this in a big way because it's critical if they're going to survive.
Thanks.
I think first and foremost, it needs to be industry and it needs to be government that really implements these energy efficiency tools. But also, I think to what Jessica was speaking to, when it comes to the household level, creating buy-in from everyday citizens around just LED light bulbs, that was something that people really jumped onto because they feel like they can actually contribute and they can do something. They don't feel necessarily as helpless with all these large high-in-the-sky ideas, and I think creating more of those things that are accessible to everyday people is really important in this transition.
And one piece on the transition that really brings the sort of the micro consumer level and the macro industry together is this the real priority on a just transition, and when we look at retooling of industry, but also on the transformation of jobs and skills that are necessary in sort of a new and clean economy. I think it'll be really interesting to see the influence that some of the NDP and Green platform pieces will have potentially on the Liberals in that respect, in terms of actual policies to support that just transition.
I think that's a great point, Jessica. Thank you for that. And what I liked about that is that you linked the heart and the mind for me. There's a smart thing we need to do for environment and economy, and what I heard you say, Toby, is that it's not a countervailing. You can win on both if we do the smart thing. But I want to connect the heart a bit more. And in September this year, we had climate marches and strikes across Canada. And Grace, you mentioned to me before we started that you joined the one here in Ottawa. Grace, how do middle-aged or even older Canadians like myself, how do we listen better? How do we really make a connection with the passion and the power of young people who are driving forward in climate strikes? There's something not connecting here that we need to figure out. What's your advice?
It's a great question, and I think some of the key words there are that there's passion and power in this youth movement, and one of the components is where is that passion and power coming from? And a lot of it is about anxiety and fear. We as youth, are standing a bit on the sidelines and watching as decision makers who might not be seeing the full severity of the climate crisis in the future, the way that we will make all of these decisions. And so there's a huge feeling of helplessness, which is why I think a lot of these people, including myself, have taken to the streets. And so realizing that there are a lot of actions that youth are doing, and I think middle-aged adults right now need to feel a lot of empathy towards this anxiety that we're all feeling. Youth today, I think, really, not that I can speak for every single youth, but we're really focused on a just transition here, just like Jessica was speaking to. It's a holistic approach to the sustainability problem. There's no ecosystem restoration without ending environmental racism. I think these are really important components as we move forward in this transition. It's a whole full circle.
Any thoughts, Grace, on the Indigenous aspects of this, in terms of Indigenous communities and young people? When you say just transition, that's got to be part of the question.
It's part of the question, it's part of the answer, and I think you saw that in the climate strike as well. The drumming circle before most of the strikes across Canada, you saw them at the front of the march and the strike, and I think that's really important around the environmental racism piece and ending the boil water advisories as a part of this just transition.
I mean, Toby, Jessica, you yourselves and myself, we have children. How do you view this? I mean, is the conversation? I know you have young children. Toby, Jess, yours a bit older. Mine are in their early 20s. What do you feel?
Well, I took my 1 and my 3-year-old to the Montreal March that Greta came to, and I was struck by the people. There was 500,000 people, but you could just feel it was a whole sea of people. And pretty clear takeaway, everyone was having fun, but people were impatient, and there was frustration, and you could see the changes coming. And so the takeaway for me was, are us old farts, are we going to be part of leading that change, or are we going to follow that change and get left behind?
Yeah, similarly took my 2-year-old to the Toronto March, and seeing other families come up to us and want to take pictures with our different signs from the different kids was really quite an emotional experience. And I think Toby, to your point around the corporate leadership and how we engage. The older generations, for me, working in a company like the Delphi Group, where we have strong leadership from the CEO down, in making it clear to staff that this is a priority. This is something that staff can take and should be taking time out of their day and helping to incent others. Our clients, our CEO sent personal letters to a number of other corporate leaders, encouraging them to do similar. So I think that sort of leadership, even if the older generations aren't necessarily at the forefront of the movement, it's very important to show that level of support.
I agree. I mean, I got to share that. I went to the first climate march in New York City about 4 years ago, and I kind of think I got to ask myself questions about what I'm changing. Because, as we talked earlier, Jess, there's a cognitive dissonance here. We work on issues like this, but then we have to look at our own behaviors, like reducing our own energy use. So I got to tell you, there's a little bit of guilt that I'm trying to challenge to your Grace into a more positive space, but realize that, the classic term would be, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. So where am I a part of the solution? And not to be, guilty about it, but actually acting on that and channeling that. So that's where I'm asking myself. And I also think in terms of change, you're looking for ideas and innovation here. And just, I wonder if I can ask you, in terms of innovation side, how do we look differently in terms of innovation in the corporate agenda? And both Jess and Toby and then Joyce coming in, how do we think about how we accelerate innovation in a much bigger way than we've ever done? It's got to be part of the solution, but are we doing it fast enough? And what can be different? Perhaps Toby and then Jess.
Sure, I think we need a jolt. We have a lot of the solutions for innovation. They're on the shelf, and we need a jolt to get them off. There's a lot of bugaboos why they're not flying off the shelf, and the easiest way to jolt an economy is to throw money into it, and then it jolts, and it jolts
right.
in line with where the money is pointing. And so that's the simplest, most effective thing we could do.
From my perspective, the Pan-Canadian framework and some of the policy levers that have been set out under the previous Liberal government, and we expect we'll see continue and hopefully go further and faster, as I was mentioning before, in the new mandate, are extremely important from an innovation and clean tech perspective in particular. I think we see that it's a bit strange to say that you need to sort of structure or do more to incent innovation when in a lot of ways it is a very organic process, right? That often results in innovation. But at the same time, we now have enough learning from both within Canada and elsewhere in the world as to what a number of those key, whether they're fiscal and tax incentives or skills and jobs training, and the broader investment landscape that needs to come together to really incent innovation. I think we're on the right track, and as I mentioned, a number of the Pan-Canadian Framework's elements are headed in the right direction. It's really, I think, a question of scale at this point, and ensuring that a number of those, particularly on the government funding side, the pots are even bigger moving forward, as opposed to the sort of patchwork that we see right now that creates a big challenge particularly for clean tech startups startups that are trying to navigate that landscape.
And if I could just jump in, this isn't about sort of giving a crutch to business or a subsidy or a giveaway. This is about a jolt. These are short-term injections of cash. It's not about long-term tax deductions or even tax deductions at all. It's about short-term injection, jolt, and then once the economy is going, it's off to the races, and it can compete, and it's scaling. We don't need to be interfering.
And I think that's also where something like the overarching intention to decarbonize the economy or net zero economy by 2050, directionally is extremely important in setting that signal to business. But then it is about that patchwork and those smaller near-term interventions that are necessary to bridge that gap and get us to the scale necessary for the change needed in terms of transition.
Grace, I want to connect on innovation. I mean, you're in your master's program. You've probably got yourself or colleagues who are really interested in how you apply your talents and your education in new innovation. What's the classroom conversation and where you land after about how innovation and what your creativity and ingenuity goes to?
It's a great question. If I had the answer of what I was going to do, I wish I could tell you. I think we have this conversation a lot in the classroom because we are unsure of what we're going to do. But some of these tax incentives and these government subsidy or these government grants and programs, they're not only investing in clean technology, but they're investing in the youth and people who are just coming out of master's programs like myself or undergraduate programs in changing over skills and jobs. So I think that's a really exciting time is for the government to be addressing that we need to move in this transition, and the market might not be totally where it needs to be right now for these clean technology companies to excel. But it is exciting to see this movement in hopes that maybe I can find myself a job in the next year or so. And yeah, I think it's definitely trickling. I think it's definitely coming into the classroom, and these conversations are happening for sure. It's very exciting. It's very exciting.
Grace is looking for a job in a year or so, just to say. I'm going to do something very different. I'm going to talk and engage the audience in a minute and ask our panelists to come in on this question. This is a global issue. We're talking as Canadians. But if you look at the Globe Forum, for example, in 2020 in Vancouver, we have people from 60, 80 countries participating. How do we as Canadians connect on a clean transition, on climate, on different materials, on new innovations globally? What's the opportunity we really haven't connected with globally? Any thoughts from you guys about the global connection? Because, we're one country among many, and we're one part of the world very fortunate with a lot of privilege. How do we engage this into be a global solution for global challenges and opportunities?
I think energy storage is kind of the key to cracking the low-carbon economy. And our abundance of minerals are the inputs to that. And we have all sorts of chemistry expertise and technological and engineering expertise. And we could really be the manufacturer of the world's batteries for the low-carbon economy. And that would be something that we could be known for. And there's a lot of people in the industry looking closely at this, and it could become real.
That's a great point in terms of harnessing the expertise and skills that we have in the energy economy for the new energy economy, because there are a lot of, I think, as we all know, working in the space, a lot of not just transferable skills, but the expertise in terms of where we are now and where we need to get to. It's people in Canada that hold a lot of that knowledge and the technology. The investment needs to scale up, of course. But I think in my view, it will be very interesting to see how the next months and years play out in terms of our ability to grapple with that question of our role in the global economy as energy leaders, as hopefully clean economy energy leaders. But recognizing that we are still highly regionalized and highly divided on some of these core challenges, and that really the directionality we have now in terms of that net zero commitment to 2050, we should be using that as the foundation of a really pragmatic and open and transparent conversation around how we get there.
Cool.
I think we ask this question a lot in the classroom because I'm usually one of the only Canadians in the classroom. It's a very diverse group within the program that I'm in, and I think that makes it really exciting because we are constantly learning from what other people are bringing to the table. I'm learning about the energy in Pakistan and India, and I think that being able to have those conversations within the school and the learning atmosphere has been really exceptional. And I think that bringing that forward in conversations like this and what is everyone else doing and how can we implement that here, that's a good format, that's a good showing within the classroom of how it's going to play out in the next couple of years as well.
And I think we've seen through the Paris Agreement and the UN process to date, when that's sort of mirrored at the national level, it's it's not sufficient for us to say, well, we're only 2% of global emissions, because there is so much more. There's so much more at play here, and from an energy intensity perspective, that's not the case. And so, as I mentioned, having that pragmatic conversation across not only the generations but regionally is, I think, going to be very necessary, particularly given how polarized the debate still remains despite yesterday's results.
And maybe not just on the technology side, but on the global mindset. We're one of the most polluting, energy-intensive countries on the planet. And if we can show that solving climate change is an opportunity, that will send a message the rest of the world can't help but hear. And if we can do it, then anybody can. And so if we can solve climate change as an issue to go on the sword, not to be on the defensive with a shield, that's something that will have reverberations well beyond our borders.
Well, I'm going to give you three an opportunity here to do a different kind of message. For the last 40 days, people have been regularly coming to my door and knocking on it and giving me messages. 4 different parties have come to the door and told me why they should get my vote. We voted. I'd like to give a chance now for you to give a message to the people who have been elected in your riding, or in fact to the party leaders. What do you need from them to engage in this process politically? We've got a minority government. The dialogue in this table with the Globe Series and with Corporate Knights doesn't stop now, it continues. What's the dialogue and message we need to send to our elected representatives so it didn't just stop yesterday when the 40 days finished?
We need a clean stimulus. What gets funded gets done. We have all sorts of solutions on the shelf. We need to get them out in the field. We need a clean stimulus of about $300 billion, financed by about $50 billion of bonds over a 6-year period. We could create 900,000 jobs. We could add $700 billion to our GDP. And usually you don't get to do this type of spending unless there's an economic contraction. Well, guess what? Economic contraction is coming down the pipe. It's the perfect time to do it.
My message would be to really continue on with the pragmatism that I think we've seen under the previous government, and as I mentioned, the Pan-Canadian framework is by no means perfect. It will not get us necessarily where the science says we need to go, but directionally, it's fundamental. It is the best best option we have, but that pragmatism, I think, moving forward in a minority scenario means that those in government really need to listen to those on both the opposing sides of the argument, but also other progressives, and be open to real pragmatic solutions that will drive that ambition to more substantive action in the near term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think as we've seen from the climate strikes and as we talked about today, youth are mobilizing. Youth are here. We've joined this movement, and I guess to the new politicians, invest in us. We're creating clean tech companies. We're starting fresh. Put your money where your mouth is, and give us a chance to really help find solutions for this problem.
Thank you. Apart from playing a role with the Globe Series, I also lead a company that works in the space of clean energy, particularly helping Indigenous communities be part of that future. That's what I spend most of my time doing, which is incredibly gratifying, but it's also hard work. I mean, the author Dorothy Lessing once wrote that change is a function of 2 things, verve and hard work. And the hard stuff is the hard work. So when you look at what you're spending time on, what your hard work is, what's enthusing you? What's enthusing you, Grace? What's enthusing you, Toby? What's enthusing you, Jess? That gives you the fortitude, the energy to change. What's turning you forward that's going to make us create a clean economy? What's in your gut? What's in your heart? What's in your mind? Grace?
Ooh, a lot. Definitely passionate about a lot right now, and I think that the main thing that I'm really fascinated with is these conversations and how we are making this transition, because I think we can all picture this beautiful world where we all drive electric vehicles, but the transition, changing the job sector and transitioning those skills and transitioning into a just transition into the sustainable Canada that I think we all can see in the future. I think that's really complicated and so messy, but that's why we're here. And I think that's really exciting, is because how can we find these very complicated solutions to all, like a huge range of problems? And that's what I'm enthused about, and probably gets me out of bed every morning and helps me get on my bike to school. So yeah, I think just the transition itself is going to be really fascinating.
So I started my career focused pretty squarely on policy and regulation, and for most of that career, I think as practitioners, we spent a lot of time arguing as to why there needed to be policy and regulation and carbon pricing and all the rest of it in place. For me, what's really heartening is that we're now in a place where we're seeing this sort of coalescing of the various drivers for action across both policy and regulation, but often more materially for business on the physical impact side of things, on the investor expectations, on consumer expectations. And so for me, finally being in a place where, at least from our perspective, climate and sustainability is, as I said, was a voting issue, but it is also top of mind. It's very messy, it's challenging. I don't think any one of us know what the, how we're going to get to 2030, 2050, if we're going to get there. But the high watermark, I think, really that we see with this election in the importance and the drivers across those new market opportunities and the policy and all of these other factors, both on risk and opportunity side, being in place is really what's driving me forward.
I think, when we started looking at the clean economy 15, 16, 17 years ago, so many of the awesome solutions were more expensive. They were awesome, but they were more expensive. And now, so many of the solutions that we need to really scale the economy out of high carbon into low carbon, they're cheaper, they're better. And when something is cheaper and it's better, you don't need the politicians, you don't even need the self-possessed Elon Musks anymore. You just need regular people to look at the bottom line and get on with it. And we're at that point now, and it's all about speed and pace.
Okay. Thanks, guys. We're nearing our time, and I'd like to begin to wrap up and give you a chance to say a closing word about how you feel our transition to a clean economy might work. And Grace, I wonder, I might turn to you and to final wrap-up thought.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for moderating, Toby and Jess. It was really great to have this conversation, and I learned a lot. I do think we didn't get enough chance to talk about the carbon pricing. I think we touched on it a couple times, but after the election last night, I think there are some things that we could talk about. Do we have any more time to talk about the carbon pricing?
Well, that's a very powerful point. Good news, I guess. We're on social media. We're not on TV, so we're not going to commercial. So why don't we do that? I mean, carbon pricing, where does it go? What's our action? 3 or 4 parties agreed that carbon pricing was needed to get to our Paris targets. It's one part of the solution. So Grace, do you want to dig into that question a bit? Carbon pricing, how do we've got carbon pricing in this country. Is it enough? We've got differences of views among jurisdictions. Where do we take it from here? How do we use it?
I think it's an important thing to talk about the carbon pricing model, the carbon price in Canada, really showing that Canadians voting for Liberal, NDP, and Green, they voted for to continue with the carbon price. I think the carbon price, the current policy, and the policies that are currently surrounding the environment, they won't get us to the Paris Agreement targets. And I think we know that, and the science has shown us that. Unless we want to increase the carbon price a lot, I think we need to look at other things that can help support the carbon price. And one of those things, I believe, is ending fossil fuel subsidies. We are putting a price on carbon, but we are subsidizing emitters, and that math doesn't add up in my head. And I think a lot of the young people I talk to on a daily basis, that doesn't add up. So I think that's one of the ways that we can help support getting to the Paris Agreement without increasing the carbon price too much.
Picking up on that point in terms of insofar as, yes, there is broad-based carbon support amongst voters for carbon pricing, I think, again, going back to this idea of the cognitive dissonance, it is a big challenge when it comes down to the willingness to pay and what it looks like, at the pumps or on our home heating bills and things like that. So, Grace, your point around the importance of those, what in the policy wonk world we'd call complementary measures, but other policies and incentives that either help magnify the price signal where it needs to be magnified to change behavior, and otherwise help to lessen that when it's at a household level, for example. Again, we have, to Toby's points earlier, we have a number of those solutions. Either we know what they are, or they've already been spelled out through parties' platforms. And so moving forward in earnest on those, while fundamentally maintaining that increase in the price, is going to be extremely important, because I think we've seen both in Canada and virtually every economy that has implemented a carbon price, it alone has never been able to reach politically has never been able to reach a point that it's high enough to be the only measure. But getting those other pieces right is extremely important, because otherwise you run the risk of there just being this sort of big mashup of of things happening, and you're not achieving that scale and the efficiency and really driving the market that we need for that for the transition.
And it takes a lot of courage to put a price on carbon. And I don't want to take anything away from that, but I think it's really not where the action is anymore on the low carbon economy. I think we're the sticks. We've tried the sticks. It's time to move to the carrots, because the technology is ready. So it's carrot time.
Right. Now, you heard it from Toby. A good vegetarian statement. It's carrot time. What I'd like to do in wrap up is I'd like to note that we are engaging a very vibrant audience, and everybody online here could have been in this panel. And so I'd like to ask our panelists to, in fact, talk to our online audience about how you'd like to dialogue with them going forward towards a clean economic transition. So Jess, and then Toby, and then Grace, if you could talk to our audience saying, how would you like to continue your conversation beyond this panel, but with everybody online and at Globe and elsewhere?
Yeah, well, I'm fortunate that I get to have these types of conversations on just about a daily basis as a consultant in the sustainability and climate space. But as I mentioned earlier, for me, really one of the key pieces in dialogue here is that we have it in the first place, because I think there is going to be a reticence, given the results and given the divisiveness of the electoral map at this point, to sort of retreat, and we saw a lot of that through the rhetoric in the election campaigns. But I would argue that really now, for all the reasons we've talked about, is the time to have that pragmatic conversation, be open to solutions, be open to other viewpoints, and there are a number of existing means, be it at the corporate level or now growing at the citizen level, for that engagement. And those are not just conversations that should be happening in the lead up or during an election. They really need to continue out into the certainly the next 4 years, but well beyond that, if we're really to set ourselves on a different trajectory here in terms of the transition to a low carbon economy.
I guess in the economy now, the low carbon solutions are growing faster than the high carbon problems. And so my plea to the colleagues and viewers out there would be to send us your stories about how you're skating to where the puck is going.
I think my question for people listening in would be, what pieces can we add to make this as just a transition as possible into a sustainable future for Canada? What do we need to keep top of mind over the next 4 years?
Thank you all. It's been an absolute pleasure to be here with all of you in this panel, engaging with our online audience. It's been a delight to be here at the incredibly beautiful Museum of Nature. Come visit next time you're in Ottawa. And this is the start of a conversation. And so therefore, I would urge us in this panel, all of you online, and others who will watch this later on streaming, to connect. And connecting is probably a great opportunity at Globe, February 10th to 13th in Vancouver, at the Vancouver Convention Center. Join us through globeseries.com/forum. This is about creativity. This is about how we channel energy and create abundance, richness very much to the just transition point that Grace and also Jess noted. Thank you for joining us. Keep the conversation going. I look forward to many great interactions for what will be a very positive future for Canada, for our economy, and the world. Thanks.